I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Antimicrobial resistance is projected to kill up to 10 million people a year by 2050. One particular area of concern is drug-resistant gonorrhea, where existing therapies are being exhausted. Taxus Pharmaceuticals is developing therapies to combat evolving superbugs by targeting their cellular infrastructure and disrupting the mechanisms that fuel antimicrobial resistance. We spoke to Greg Mario, president and CEO of Taxus, about the public health threat posed by drug-resistant gonorrhea, the approaches it's taking to develop new antimicrobial treatments, and the need for new funding models to bring new therapies to market. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
We're going to talk about drug-resistant gonorrhea, Taxus Pharmaceuticals, and its efforts to develop a first-in-class antimicrobial treatment for the condition. Let's start with gonorrhea. What is it?
It's a sexually transmitted disease. It's the second most common STD, as they refer to them, to chlamydia. And it's growing in prominence and in prevalence.
And how does the condition manifest itself and progress?
So it's passed on via sexual contact with an infected person, and symptoms usually show up within 1 to 14 days after that infection. In men and women, the side effects are different. In men, common symptoms are discharge from the penis, pain or burning on urination or upon urination, and painful or swollen testes. And oddly enough, most women with gonorrhea, they have it, right? But they do not have symptoms, or they do not notice them or associate them with the disease, which is challenging. But if they do occur, the symptoms include same type of things: vaginal discharge, in this case, pain, burning upon urination, but also vaginal bleeding between periods, so off cycle or during sexual intercourse. And if it's left untreated, gonorrhea can progress and lead to very serious health issues, including pelvic inflammatory disease, infertility, and a significant increase in risk of HIV infection.
And how big a public health risk does this represent?
Well, it's large and it's growing. The World Health Organization does a lot of statistics. So does the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. Apparently in 2020, the WHO estimated that there were 82.4 million new gonorrhea infections across the world. And the CDC estimates that over 1.6 million new gonorrhea infections occur annually. And the reason it's such a significant problem is there are only a few remaining therapeutics available to treat it. We're running out rapidly. And certain strains are so highly resistant that even ceftriaxone, the gold standard drug for many years, doesn't work very well. And without new antibiotics, these infections will become untreatable. Taxus is going to try to change that course We're committed to developing novel drugs with unique mechanisms of action, and our lead candidate, TXA 15054, is moving rapidly toward clinical trials, particularly with the support of a recent $2.97 million grant from the NIH. And this compound, TXA 15054, has proven efficacy in the infected animal model against the most resistant gonorrhea strains. It's quite promising.
Just to clarify something you say we're running out of therapies. By that, you mean that because resistance is growing, that our existing arsenal is becoming ineffective?
That is absolutely correct. And there's a group of particular strains that are like incredibly resistant, even to the only gold standard drug that's been working, and slowly but surely it's not. And pretty soon nothing will work unless we bring new things to the market.
Well, how prevalent are resistant strains of gonorrhea?
Well, I guess it's again an estimate, but the Centers for Disease Control estimates that about a third of the new cases are now drug resistant infections, so about 500,000 per year.
For resistant strains, there have been some new treatments that have been used. How do these compare to traditional antibiotics in terms of their mechanism of action and their efficacy?
Well, in general, Daniel, the current pipeline for gonorrhea drugs is very limited. The two drugs you refer to are not yet on the market. They're progressing through clinical trials and expected to make it, but you got to get there, right? And while they are promising drug candidates, like all drugs, they have some shortcomings, including what appears to be inferiority clinically to ceftriaxone. They don't. One of them doesn't work in pharyngeal infections, which are important to cover. They have very high frequencies of mutational resistance, which means that over time, resistance is going to show up quicker. They're also cross-resistant with some of the current antimicrobials, and the biggest issue, I think, with these two drugs or drug candidates is that they have broad spectrums of activity, and this means they kill some of the good bugs in the gut, which could lead to some pretty serious complications. Antibiotic-associated diarrhea, C. difficile, which is a real problem, reduced nutrient absorption. I mean, just bad stuff, because the biome is something that, bacteria, we can't live with them, and sometimes we can't live without them. It's a balance. We can't digest most of our food without the good biome. So anytime we upset that apple cart, it has side effects and secondary issues. The Taxus's, lead drug candidate, TXA 15054, is unique given its dual mechanism of action, which dramatically reduces resistance concerns. And it has a very narrow spectrum of activity, what we call high target selectivity. In other words, TXA 15054 does not affect the good bacteria in the gut.
Well, let's talk about that. How does 15054 differ from other approaches?
Well, it's an entirely new application of an old technology. It works by inhibiting dihydrofolate reductase. And this is part of the folate metabolic process, which is essential to all life, whether bacterial or human. Without DHFR working and the folate metabolic pathway working, we would all die. And that the thing is, it's an old target. It was used primarily for cancer drugs because it is so toxic to human cells. And the idea with cancer is you want to kill the cancer and hopefully not, too many of the good cells in the human. In this case, in the past, there was only one application of DHFRs in general as an antibiotic, and it wasn't targeting gonorrhea; it was targeting other pathogens. In fact, oddly enough, back in the day when I was a young man, sort of before electricity, I um, I sold this drug as a sales rep for Burroughs Wellcome. And this drug is called trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. It's a bit of a mouthful. That doesn't work anymore. It's a really old drug. That was the only one that really was an antibiotic that was viable. But there's never been an antibiotic with a DHFR inhibition profile that targets gonorrhea. So we're a first in class.
Is there a potential to develop resistance to that mechanism?
Well, there's always potential, and it's inevitable because these bugs mutate when they're under attack and at risk of dying. And over time, those mutations will eventually result in a viable bacterium that that is resistant to the drug that was used to try to kill it. So over time and exposure, you'll always need new antibiotics. The real question is how long will new antibiotics last? And that's related to how long you can push off that resistance process. And that has to do with that frequency of mutational resistance. So everything, will eventually, run out of gas, if you will. And that's why we have to get the machine rolling again so that we have, a portfolio across the board of new antibiotics in the pipeline, new antibiotics going onto the market, new antibiotics coming into the pipeline. This is a constant battle. It's never going to end. And we're just going to have to keep fighting it. And right now, we're losing the fight.
What's known about the safety and efficacy of 15054 from studies you've done to date?
Well, the efficacy is proven out in an animal model, an infected animal with the worst of the worst resistant strains, and so you basically measure bacterial load over time. So you have a test case that gets infected, a group of animals, and then over time you measure, is that bacterial load increasing? And you just draw blood and you measure it. And then you have, that's called a control group. And then you have the group that is infected and then treated with TXA 15054. And it was really remarkable. We've only run a couple of studies so far, but I mean, the data is just, it's amazing. Within 3 days, same animals, same amount of inoculum that they were infected with, undetectable in 3 days. No gonorrhea bacteria. It was all gone.
What's the development path forward?
Well, it's a pretty standard approach. We there's some standard approaches to drug development, no matter what drug you're developing. So right now, uh, we're being financed by the NIH grant, and we're in what's called lead optimization. So we know we have some candidates that look promising, like TXA 15054. And now we have to kind of put it to the test and really dig in to see if we can find the optimal balance between efficacy and toxicity. And that's just a stepwise process. And there are some very cookie cutter tests that you just have to perform, and they're very informative. And sometimes that feedback can allow you to make some tweaks to the compound, make some modifications that either increase efficacy or decrease toxicity. So we're in that process, and the ultimate objective at this stage is to get to clinical trial phase one as fast and as diligently as possible. Oh, and by the way, Daniel, we've done this before. Taxus, I've done it a lot of times, but Taxus has done it before with the oral anti-MRSA drug candidate, TXA 709. That's going into phase two. So we know what we're doing. We've got a great team.
Obviously, the problem of resistant strains of bacteria extend well beyond gonorrhea. Taxus is developing other candidates to address other resistant bacteria. Though your experimental therapies take different approaches, as I understand it, they all seek to disrupt the bacterial cell wall architecture. What's the case for this approach, particularly with regards to resistant strains?
Yeah, that's a great question. 20,000 foot perspective when we started this company, I was not interested in developing next generation Me Too drug candidates. Like the sixth generation cephalosporin, the third generation tetracycline. That doesn't interest me because that's an incremental innovation. It's meaningful, but all it does is put off the inevitable. We're not changing the game. It's just incremental. So it adds a little value, but not much because it's the same mechanisms of action. These are old concepts. Instead, we're developing anti-resistance solutions. These are transformational innovations. So instead of, you think about a gardener, they come, they cut your lawn, they trim the tree, and it looks good for a while. Then you got to have them come back and they trim the tree again. Generation X after generation. We want to pull that tree out from the roots. So the idea about root causes of resistance, and there are a number, but the ones that are associated with the cell wall were very interesting to us because it's essential, obviously, having a cell wall. And by targeting the architecture of the cell wall, the foundation of the structure, function, and growth, we can hit a whole bunch of different resistance causes, if you will, that are affecting lots of different antibiotics out there. And if you do that, it's like instead of shooting things one at a time, you can take a shotgun and you can cover a lot of ground. And we've proven with one of our exciting technologies, the efflux pump inhibitor platform. Efflux pumps are like bilge pumps on a boat. And they're basically these, you can imagine, they're sweepers that are associated with the cell wall. And these sweepers push antibiotics out of the cell. And it requires higher and higher doses in an effort to overwhelm the pumps. And ultimately, the doses required to overwhelm those pumps fall outside the therapeutic window, and that drug is put on the shelf. So we've shown with our EPIs that we can resurrect the activity of 28 old, ineffective generic antibiotic drugs from 10 different classes. So these are drugs that are done, they're gathering dust, and we bring them back to life. I like to call it the Frankenstein project. And our lead program in that space, in the EPI space, is also supported by the NIH $2.67 million grant. So we have two separate significant NIH grants. And if you think about what this platform, true platform technology could be, it's akin to the beta lactamase platform technology. In this case, it targets an enzyme, not the cell wall, but it's the same concept. So all of us had amoxicillin, right? When we were kids, some of our kids had it. And, we had it, you and I, Daniel, for ear infections, sinus infections. Well, it started to get long in the tooth. It wasn't working as well as it used to. And a whole bunch of other drugs in the penicillin family, about 5 classes, weren't working. And researchers at Glaxo in the 70s identified the cause, and that was beta lactamase, an enzyme that breaks down all of these penicillin type drugs. So the secret sauce they came up with, the first beta-lactamase inhibitor called clavulanic acid, not a household name, but when you take that clavulanic acid and you add it to the same active ingredient, amoxicillin, Augmentin was born, and that drug still works today. So that again is a Frankenstein play, and that's a multi-faceted, multi-armed, and multi-billion-dollar business. We think the EPIs could fit that same model.
Given you have these different approaches, how do you determine the best one for a given disease? And is it a matter of just screening it against targets, or is there some rationale you use in determining the best approach?
Yeah, well, with respect to the EPIs in particular, um, the one efflux pump system is not the same as the other. They still do the same things, but they have different characteristics. And so, for example, our lead EPI program blocks efflux pump systems in Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And we have other EPIs that we're looking to develop that are more targeted to other pathogens. So we can basically tailor make the EPIs to attack and target specific efflux pump systems, and they are unique within each pathogen group. So that's a very interesting thing. We can kind of mix and match. Another way to determine how to apply the technology beyond efflux pumps is the therapeutic approach that takes advantage of an antibiotic class effect. For example, a virgin mechanism of action, something that hasn't been on the market before. So there's no pre-existing resistance. And Taxus's dihydrofolate reductase inhibitors fit that bill. And they're very targeted, in this case, to highly resistant. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on that one. I'm supposed to say gonorrhea. That's what we're talking about. Sorry about that.
You want to take that again?
Yeah, let's try it again.
Sure.
So in other cases, we improve drug properties um, of existing antibiotics, such as ceftonir, when combined with TXA 709, there's a synergistic effect. Ceftonir never had activity against MRSA, and now it does when it's administered along with TXA 709. And finally, a way to determine what to target is based on a specific class of antibiotics. And those with virgin mechanisms of action, those that have not ever been applied before in the clinic, and there's no pre-existing resistance in that population. And Taxus's dihydrofolate reductase inhibitors are the first ever of a new class of antimicrobials. And that's why they should work, and they work very well, very high potency.
You've mentioned your grant from the National Institutes of Health to work on your experimental gonorrhea therapy. Drug developers and private investment have moved away from antibiotic development starting in the 1990s because of concerns that the development of resistance would limit the market lives of new drugs. How far are you able to advance these therapies? How far are you able to advance these therapies with public funding? And what's the landscape today for private funding?
Well, Daniel, it's true. Most big pharma companies left the antimicrobial space many decades ago in some cases, but it is not due to fear of resistance. No, they left because of the broken economics of the antibiotics market. You know, this is a short course therapy, it's curative treatment, and we became very used to inexpensive generic drugs because, you know, we've had antibiotics for 100 years, right? So big pharma moved on to greener pastures, as you might say. But now they're returning, and there's two reasons, in my opinion. First, they realize that their businesses will suffer. if AMR is not addressed. Because if we don't address AMR, we go back to the pre-penicillin days when average life expectancy was in the 40s, right? So the wonders of modern medicine are lost upon you, as well as prescription meds that treat chronic conditions and keep us alive into our 80s. There's also a second um, reason, and that economic model that I mentioned, but this is set to improve significantly. There's something called the Pasteur Act, which has been bantied about for some time. And I think now, since COVID, people are taking it a little more seriously. It will eventually be enacted, and it provides powerful incentives to stimulate research and development, to draw pharma companies back with a carrot. And that carrot can be as much as a $1 billion bounty payment for breakthrough. How do we define that? I'm not sure. I'm sure there's still a lot of discussion, but a $1 billion bounty payment for an approved drug that's considered crucial to the anti-AMR fight, and as well as an initial order, if you will, government stockpiling, like they do with chemical and biological warfare treatments like anthrax. They'll buy a whole bunch of supply and they'll just stash it in places. They're going to do that here too, because that's a really big first order and a lot of money to make up for how much it costs to develop the drug, and it buys the pharma company time to ramp up their sales because it's usually slow, especially if there remains a generic alternative that is still somewhat viable. The doctor will reach for that first, and then maybe something is second, and then third, the more expensive, newer agent. So this buys them time. It gives them a carrot. It incentivizes them to develop drugs in the space again, and they're coming back. Roche is coming back. Pfizer's talking about it. They're making some moves. Glaxo is definitely active. Um, so, I think the big players realize they have to do this because their business will not last with chronic meds, right? And there's a nice carrot and reward for taking that risk. If you're successful, you'll get paid. You'll get initial sales order, and you'll be off to the races. I'm very optimistic about both public and private access to capital.
You mentioned the Pasteur Act, which hasn't passed Congress yet. There have been other incentives that were put in place previously to spur development of new antibiotics. How effective have they been in stimulating development?
Well, not very much. And it's because it was kind of like sticking your toes in the water. It was kind of a half effort. It was meaningful, and it certainly helped. And the NIH support, early stage development, CARB-X, very early stage development. That's a public-private consortium, including the NIH, the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation. And by the way, we got a $3.2 million grant. That was our first big one some years ago, completed it successfully. And then we moved to the NIH for the next two. So I think the way to take it seriously is to put some money where your mouth is. And, the cost of developing a drug is only increasing over time. And the return on investment with the current pricing regime, given all the generics, it just doesn't work. So there's got to be an incentive. The Pasteur Act will pass, even though I thought it would have passed by now. But I believe it will. And I think the pharma companies are making the move now for that primary reason, which is if we don't figure this out, our business is going to suffer significantly because if people are dead, they're not going to take our drugs. But ultimately also because they believe that this act will pass and then they have a chance. And then it becomes a race, a competition. I love it. So I'm very optimistic.
What would the Pasteur Act mean to a company like yours?
Well, if we were to go all the way through phase 3, it would mean a lot. And that would be huge, because if you get a breakthrough drug, and that's what we're working on, we're not working on Me Too's. If, when we get to that point, if we decide to go there on our own, if you will, that would defray a lot of the costs associated with pushing through phase 3. Very important. Yep.
And how far will existing funding take you, and what's the plan for raising additional capital to fund the clinical development of your programs?
Yeah, so the approach we've taken so far, I've raised over 23 million since inception, all from high net worth individuals and private family offices. And I'm very capital management sensitive. It's pretty inexpensive to make chemicals, but once you get to clinical trials, that cash register starts getting hit, right? So the 10 million approximately in total from the non-dilutive funding grants, the NIH and CARB-X, helped us significantly, particularly getting through COVID, which was a very dry season for raising capital for everybody for anything. But we're getting out of that, and I think that people have become much more aware of the significant threat to global societal health that AMR represents. Glass half full regarding COVID, it got people's attention, and no one wants to see that happen again. And by the way, that's like a shot across the bow compared to the tsunami that is coming at us. It is projected by many think tanks that by 2050, 10 million people will die, and some have even higher numbers. 10 plus million people will die every year. Think about the disruption to our economies, to society, it could break us and send us back to the dark ages. And I know I'm gloom and doom on that, but it's real. So I think a lot of people are taking interest, and we will find the right amount of money. And ultimately, my goal is to focus on our core competencies, and that is design of unique chemicals, synthesis, scale up, and early stage development, all the way through phase 1, which is not terribly expensive. And hopefully I can find a pharmaceutical partner, that has the breadth of knowledge and experience that I can get and I can access, but I have to reach out, to separate parties. They have everybody under the same roof, and that's much more effective, at least in my experience from being in the pharma industry for so many years. So I think, we get it to a certain point, someone will partner with us and will support our needs, and then, the way we get paid back is milestone based. So if the drug succeeds, then we take a bite of that. So our investors get a return on their investment, and the pharma companies can limit their risk, because they basically don't have to pay a whole lot of money to get that foot in the door. That's my approach. So phase 3, if we go that route, that's a different type of funding if we want to go alone. And if we did that, then we'd probably go IPO.
Greg Mario, President and CEO of Taxus Pharmaceuticals. Greg, thanks so much for your time today.
Hey, thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.